Hi, Misha here, and a couple months ago, did a video on this aircraft here, the Mitsubishi A7M2 as it happens. And this is a very late war aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy, intended to be a carrier-based fighter to replace the A6M50, and really go up against the P-51, the F-6F, and the F-4U. And this aircraft technically went into production because one production model was made, although there were as many as 9 prototypes, because work had been underway at Mitsubishi really for a very long time. But that's a story for that video. So this is a relatively obscure aircraft towards the end of the war, and a pretty good performer. But compared to this aircraft, it's positively mainstream. This is the Kyushu J7W Shinden. Very interesting design. Notice it has canards, and notice it has a giant 6-bladed propeller in the back, and a very interesting rear. Just a very interesting design in general, and honestly pretty reminiscent of many Cold War era designs. Kind of reminds me of some of the Swedish aircraft, or even some of the aircraft out of France. Quite a neat concept. And this is also Japanese Navy, but this was designed to be a land-based, short-range, high-performance interceptor. That was kind of the name of the game at the end of the war for a lot of the land-based assets, was whatever they could do to go up against the B-29. It was pulverizing Japan. And this never went into production, but 2 prototypes were made and even flown, so it did make it much further than the drawing board. And it has a pretty neat history. But first, is with most of these Japanese aircraft, especially the more obscure ones, this is a 1/72 scale diecast from De Agostini, who kind of inherited the old IXO tooling and improved it. And pretty neat. They come with gear up or down, a basic cockpit interior, but they are predominantly metal, like the wings and fuselage. And you do get a pretty neat little spinning propeller. And they're inexpensive, $20-$30. And you get a magazine, which is great if you read Japanese, because these are all imports. And this one just came in, and it's just too neat not to show. But with that, the history. This design was at least the basic concept of having this layout with canards and kind of a large swept wing in the back and an engine in the back. This idea came from a Japanese Navy Lieutenant Commander. He proposed it to the Navy in early 1943 as an interceptor to give better speed, maneuverability, altitude, what have you. And they liked it, so a small team at the technical branch in the Navy worked on it, kind of got it going, and they would ultimately make 3 unpowered gliders just to test the canard concept. And after the gliders did okay in testing, they would go ahead and slap a basic engine on one. And this would, of course, be a propeller, but from the very beginning, the idea was to start off with the propeller, but make it so that when jet technology were available, a jet engine could be applied. While Japan never really did a lot with jets, they were allies with Germany, and they had already borrowed several engines like the HA-40 from Germany. So the idea of borrowing German jet engine technology was very realistic. In fact, it did happen at the end of the war. So at the end of 1943, the Navy says, yeah, let's progress with this. Let's see what we can do. But of course, most of the big names like Mitsubishi and Nakajima were very busy. So they assigned the project to Kyushu, who was around, did things, but had leftover production capability and had not yet been heavily damaged by the war. So they got to work finishing out the prototype design, kind of figuring out what this is going to be, turning it into an actual interceptor because, up to this point it was just a glider concept. So work began on designing and building the first prototype in June of 1944, and because it was such a radical design, they had to do a lot of math by hand. And so this took pretty much the rest of the year. They'd work on the prototype basics, they'd work with the math. The Mitsubishi HA-43 engine was selected, which was actually the same engine used in the A7M over here, which is a reason I brought it out. And they decided to fit this with 4 30mm cannon, only 60 rounds each, but this was meant to be a short-term defensive interceptor, not a dogfighter or a long-range fighter. It could also carry a couple of very small bombs, but that probably never would have happened. So, by April of 1945, the prototype is done, and everything's pretty much ready to go, but of course the war is definitely turning against the Japanese at this point. And they could have just ended it there, but instead they finished a second prototype, and they would take to the air. In fact, the original concept designer, that Lieutenant Commander, would pilot it for its maiden test flight on August 3rd, 1945. And there would be 2 more test flights of this J7W design, somewhat ironically, both on the days of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even before that, in May, even before there had been a test flight, the Japanese Navy ordered this into full production. Kyushu was to build 30 a month, with Nakajima delivering 120 a month, so they wanted 150 per month on an aircraft that wasn't at that time even ready for test flying. But then again, into the war. What do they end up getting? Well, relatively large, about 32 feet long, a wingspan of about 36.5 feet. Like I said, it has 4 30mm cannon. Max altitude of over 39,000 feet, so better than pretty much anything else Japan had. Of course, the endurance was quite limited, but that's alright. It did need to be greater. And whereas this A7M had a max speed of about 390, maybe 400 miles per hour, depending on configuration and model, this seemed like it could top out at 470, maybe even 480 miles per hour. So that's really fast for a piston aircraft. German experiments and even production with similar kind of pusher style piston planes with the propeller in the rear also resulted in quite good performance, quite good speed. But of course, the war would be over before anything would really happen. But it's a really neat proof of concept, and the Americans thought so as well. So somewhat ironically, one of these still survives in the world today. A lot of Japanese aircraft don't, even ones that were mass-produced. Of the 2 prototypes that we knew existed, at least as far as we know, one was scrapped officially, but the other was dismantled, created over to America, studied. It doesn't seem like they ever assembled it and test flew it again, but they did study the airframe and the aerodynamics, and they would hold on to it for a long time. But I believe in 1960, could be wrong on that, the U.S. Navy would donate the 1 J7W to the Smithsonian, who still has it to this very day. Although I think I've read some people say they might have lost a few nuts and bolts. But considering I don't believe there are any complete B5N Kates in the world, so it's kind of interesting that there is essentially a complete J7W. Of course, this never got an Allied code name because it never was used. But a neat concept and a very interesting looking aircraft for World War II. It's strangely modern looking even by today's standards. Take the propeller off and streamline it a bit, throw a jet engine in, you could see this being a modern aircraft. Put some missiles under the wings. Alright, I digress. But yeah, this just came in from D'Agostini, and I like what they do. They're cheap enough that you don't really have to worry about breaking the bank. They're at that kind of just fun price range, and they do some odd aircraft for sure. And these also come with a magazine, so kind of neat there. And same goes for this A7M. I picked it up just because I like the Zero series, and this is what would have replaced them.